In this video, I'm going to introduce complex numbers, and then we're going to do quite a few examples where we're just doing some basic math with complex numbers. So first, what is a complex number? So z, which is a plus b times I, where a and b are real numbers, and I is called the imaginary number, which is the square root of -1. Okay? Z is the complex number. So z has a real part, which is a, which is a real number, and then the imaginary part. Okay? Now, when you put a complex number into this format, real plus imaginary, this is called standard form. Okay? And we want all of our answers to be in standard form when we have complex numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with some examples. Okay, so here I have, this is a complex number minus another complex number. And at the end, I want to have just a single complex number, okay, in standard form. So to do this, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute that negative sign I see there. So I'll have minus 3 minus square root of -16. Now, what is the square root of -16? Let me go ahead and erase that. That's the same thing as the square root of 4 times -1. Oh, not 4, sorry. Square root of 16 times -1, right? -16 is 16 times -1. So I can break out that square root to being the square root of the 16 and the square root of the -1. Now, square root of -1 is I by definition. Okay, so this becomes -3 minus, square root of 16 is 4, and then square root of -1 is I. So that becomes 4i. Alright, now let's combine like terms. So I have this -3 and that 5, so that makes 2. And then I have this plus 8 and this minus 4i. So that makes plus 4i. Okay, and so there you go. That is my answer in standard form. So you see there's the real part, and then there's the imaginary part. So it's a complex number. Let's do another example. All right, so in this example, actually first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make these square root of negative numbers into imaginary numbers. So I'll have 13 minus, okay, now the square root of -9, this is going to be the square root of 9 times square root of -1. So that's going to be 3i, right? Because the square root of 9 is 3. And then so that's going to be 3i. Plus 5 plus square root of 64 is going to be 8i. Because the square root of 64 is 8. And then the square root of -1 is I. So now let's combine like terms. So I have 13 and 5. That makes 18. And -3i and plus 8i. So that makes plus 5i. Alright? And that is my answer. 18i plus 5i. Alright? Let's go ahead and do another example. Alright, in this example, I'm doing multiplication. So, the way I'm going to start is by foiling. You know, that's the way you would multiply, something looks like this times something looks like that. So let's FOIL. So the first is 3 times 4, which is 12. The inner is -7i times 4, which would be -28i. The outer would be 3 times 3i, which would be 9i. And the last would be -21i squared, right? That's -7i times 3i. So that's -21i squared. Oh, what is I squared? Okay, let's talk about that for a second. So I is the square root of -1. So if you square I, you should get -1, right? Because if I is the square root of -1, anything that you square, then you get what's in the inside. So that's -1. So let's go ahead and write that. So we have 12. Let's go ahead and we can combine these two terms. So that'd be minus 19i. And then this instead of being minus 21, it's going to be plus 21 because this I squared is negative 1. Okay, so that changes the sign. All right, and then let's go ahead and combine those two. So I have 21 and 12, and that makes 33 minus 19I. There you go, there's my answer in standard form. Let's do another example. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this from being negative 3 to being the square root of 3 times I. Okay, because that's the square root of 3 times the square root of negative 1. Then 4 minus, again, square root of 3 times I. All right, now let's distribute. So then I'll end up having 4 times the square root of 3 times I minus the square root of 3 times I times the square root of 3 times I. Okay, that's 4 square root of 3 times I minus, now square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3, and I times I is negative 1. Okay, so that's square root of 3 times square root of 3, and I times I. So then I have 4 square root of 3I plus 3. Okay, to write that in standard form, I should have the real first, and then the imaginary part second. Okay, and that's my answer. Let's do one last example. Okay, so again, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write this, instead of writing square root of negative 2, I'm going to write square root of 2 times I, right? Because that's the square root of negative 2 times the square root of negative 1. I'm going to write this twice as opposed to just saying it's squared, so that way I can easily FOIL. Alright, so the first would be negative 5 times negative 5, which is 25. The inner would be negative 5 square root of 2I. The outer is negative 5 square root of 2I. And the last is plus, so square root of 2 times square root of 2 is 2. So square root of 2 times square root of 2 is 2, right? And then I times I is negative 1. So I end up with 25 minus 10 square root of 2, I minus 2. Let's go ahead and combine like terms. So instead of it being 25, 25 minus 2, which is 23 minus 10 times square root of 2, I. And that's my answer.